leaders have to be collaborative. There's just isn't much place in the world for leaders who just order and dictate people around. That's especially important in public education because we typically don't have the ability that if you've got a team member who's just not fully there, who's just not contributing, they may be tenured. And so they may have virtually lifetime employment unless they've committed some egregious act, pretty much their years for life, because of the whole academic freedom issues and all that stuff, and just the muscle that they've been able to exert politically. And that's fine. It's just the world in which we live. But it requires that leaders make sure that people are engaged. They feel like they're contributing. They're looking forward to coming to work. They still remember why they're coming to work, why they're getting out of bed, because you don't, in business where you can just say, you're just not fitting in and we're going to set you loose. That typically is not at the disposal of school leaders. Always known about Chicago's Second City Theater. And so many of American comics, and Canadian ones too, because of the Second City in Toronto, have come through Second City. So many of the big names had a stint there. And so everyone who signs up for the beginning improv program sees themselves as the next Colbert or, Tina Fey or whoever, your comedy idol is. And I had amazing improv teachers, just phenomenal. My first one was Judy Fabjans. She changed my life. She opened up doors. And, the thing about improv is you got to get out of your skin. You got to get out of your mind, your head, and being worried about, what are people going to think and how silly can I be or whatever. And Judy was just the perfect teacher for that first class. So much of my persona was a professional persona as a school superintendent, as a principal. And to kind of break through that was a real gift.
Has it ever occurred to you the value and benefit of learning the art of storytelling or even stand-up comedy for your application of leadership? It was a bit of a new one on me, but today's guest, Dr. Ray, is an entrepreneur, a stand-up comic, an author, a speaker, and a professor. He has an amazing energy. He's had an incredible career, beginning with a career in education, ultimately as a school superintendent. He spent time living overseas in Rio de Janeiro, and now today he teaches in Kentucky. Today he is an associate professor of educational leadership at Eastern Kentucky University, where he teaches graduate level educational leadership courses. His journey has also included coming out as gay in 2010 at the age of 50, after being married for 20 years. Some time on the stage doing stand-up comedy in various venues, including Chicago. We'll be hearing all about these many and various life experiences, the lessons that it taught him about leadership, running businesses, the world of education and teaching, and more besides. It's going to be a really interesting and enjoyable conversation.
Welcome to the Leading with Integrity podcast. Leadership talk for the modern manager. With your host, David Hatch.
Very pleased to welcome you onto the show today. Welcome to Leading with Integrity, Ray. It's great to have you. I'm really looking forward to our conversation.
Great. I appreciate the invitation.
Oh, no worries at all. Yeah, as I say, it's great to have you. And we'll kick things off by really handing over the virtual reins, the virtual mic to you to introduce yourself to listeners. Tell us a bit about your background, your experience so far, what you're up to today, what gets you out of bed in the morning.
So I'm Ray Lauk. I'm currently an associate professor of educational leadership and also management in the business school at Eastern Kentucky University. This is a post-retirement career. I retired out of Illinois public education, where I spent most of my career there, and mostly as a school superintendent. And once I retired, I was able, frankly, to afford going into higher ed because with the pension, my bills are paid till the day I die. And so I'm reaping the rewards of a career in public education because now I can do what I really want to do. And I'm just having a blast here. My two areas my teaching responsibilities tend to be mostly with educational leadership students. So we certify principals and superintendents and some other certificates here in Kentucky. My areas of research tend to fall into two main areas. One is looking at the impact of sexual orientation on school superintendent leadership. I was a gay superintendent. I'm now researching those, and I've had one book chapter, one peer-reviewed article, and now I'm working on expanding that because I have so much data from all those interviewees about their experiences ranging from the 80s to current superintendents, that I'm working on a book project currently entitled Outleading, the Impact of Sexual Orientation on School Superintendent Leadership. It'll be a combination of kind of my memoir, my experiences, as well as true qualitative research based on the interviews of the others. Academically, I'm Illini from the University of Illinois, and I have a PhD, MBA, and a master's in education from Illinois. My undergrad was from the University of Colorado at Boulder. And most of my career prior to this has been public education, mostly in Illinois. I taught sixth grade for a few years, then jumped into administration because I knew I wanted to be a superintendent. That was the real job that I wanted. And but you have to go through certain hoops. And so I started off as a sixth grade teacher, quickly got into administration, where I was an assistant principal and principal. And then 1993, got my first break as a 33-year-old superintendent in downstate Illinois. So also in terms of my experiences, I've had rural downstate Illinois experiences where the entire school district had 600 students in 3 schools all on one campus, but it was 100 square miles of corn and soybeans. So it was very rural, very rural. And yet, even though it was rural, my board was one of the most educated boards I had. My board president was a PhD from MIT. My another board member was a PhD from Illinois in agriculture economics for Archer Daniels Midland. Nurse, entrepreneur, banker, other people. So it was a very interesting board and a very interesting place. From there, I went overseas to the American School of Brasilia, where I spent a couple of years there. My wife is from Brazil. I mentioned I was a gay superintendent, but I am still married to my wife. And that was a fascinating experience because going from a very rural community to an international world capital was just amazing. There were times we would be invited to dinners and I would be the only one not an ambassador. And so it was a real heady experience. We served the community. The Brazilian community was largely the politicians who lived in Brasilia, and as well as the other diplomatic community. But among some of the Brazilians, it was like, I will never see that kind of wealth ever again. It was just extreme wealth among that school, among our parents. So it was a fascinating experience. Then I came back to Illinois, bounced around in another downstate district, then the suburban school district, and for a short stint as an interim administrator in a Chicago Public Schools contract school, which is like a charter school. So I've had really the breadth of experiences. And then there was one time where I stepped out for 3 years and was the marketing manager for the education vertical for GE Security, which was a General Electric business that was shortly after 9/11. So we were focused on helping keep schools safe and secure using GE technology, of course. And that was a fascinating experience, too, to step out of public education and go into corporate America. And I considered myself having landed at the top of the heap when I landed at GE. It was just fascinating. I still do speaking on some of the things that I learned from that experience. So that's kind of the way around. And then, like I say, and then I retired and came to Kentucky.
Yeah. Then you retired and carried on working. Yeah, gotcha.
Yeah. And it's a whole, and I
sense.
really recommend it because it's a whole different approach to working, because my philosophy is this is not a job. It is a lifestyle, because also higher education doesn't pay much, but it does allow you to do the fun things that you want to do. And my philosophy is the day it is no longer fun, they'll never see me again. I'll pack up my office. I'll move out of my apartment overnight. I'll be gone. And because I don't have to worry about the financial issues, because like I said, because I got a pension, I've got this backup plan. And so it really is a different way of looking at work and career when you don't have to worry about that paycheck. And I still want to make as much money as I can, but I know it's not going to be here.
Yeah, fair enough. But I think there's a lot to be said at any stage of your career if you're fortunate enough to be able to do what you love and to be able to do the research on the issues that matter to you as well. That has to be an amazing opportunity.
Well, that's right. I mentioned 2 research areas. I only mentioned one of those, but the second one is looking at the impact of conservative political partisan groups on school board elections. Because in the United States, of course, something happened in 2016 when Trump was elected, and there was this wave of partisan political groups, QAnon, Moms for Liberty, 1776 Project, that started to exercise their muscle on local school board elections in ways that we've never seen before. There have always been certain partisan groups involved in school board elections. I mean, that's just democracy. But they tended to be, I think, like Catholic school parents who were always wanting vouchers so that they can get credit for their tuition that they're paying to their Catholic school. Teacher unions have oftentimes been involved in elections. In fact, I was one of Illinois' first 18-year-old elected school board members, and the local teachers union supported me, printed all my campaign literature. So it's not unheard of to have this kind of influence in school board elections. But there's something different about this, in that it's more of a coordinated national effort. It's more ideological. It's more copycat from one state to another state, where issues are being thrown in the community's faces that really don't exist. Things like CRT, critical race theory. It's a graduate level concept. I believe I know 2 people who actually study it. But if you listen to Fox News and some of these other candidates, you'd think it's being taught in every school. It's not. If you ask the average elementary teacher, they can't even define CRT because it's not part of their world. It's not part of their universe. But these are kind of dog whistle issues that some of these groups use to get support. And of course, these groups are trashing. They're using kids as their victims. You look at the number of trans kids in the United States, and the kind of it's just pure abuse that many of them are receiving from their schools and their legislatures. I'll say here in Kentucky, our legislature has harming children as a legislative priority, and that's just criminal. That shouldn't be, but that's the world in which we live.
Yeah, I mean, I was going to say I suppose it's unavoidable, isn't it, given the way the system works, that education will become politicized. But at the same time, it's kind of horrifying that it is, isn't it? I mean, if anything in our society should be concerned about objective and scientific approaches to learning and things like that, it should be early education.
One would think the thing we would actually want is to educate kids in a way to help them make decisions, to evaluate statements that are made by candidates, by politicians, to judge the veracity and the factualness, and to throw out the bums who are lying to us. One would think, but that's not always the way it is.
It's not dissimilar on this side of the Atlantic either. Unfortunately, it's maybe not quite as bad in terms of the direct politicization of education, but certainly key tools like critical thinking. In my own education, I didn't really encounter that in a sense that I was being told this is what it is, this is what it means, this is how you do it, until I was at undergraduate level.
Mm-hmm.
And that's madness, because you're practically an adult by that point. In a lot of respects, it's too late to be learning that.
Right. Right. Yeah, it's an interesting phenomenon. And as we get into another political race now, another campaign election cycle, I'm anticipating we're going to see this getting all revved up all over again. And I fear that. Although, it's interesting because as divisive as public education, as well as our society is right now, I'm not sure it's any worse than it ever has been. I'm 64 years old, so I was in elementary school, like during the Vietnam era and the civil rights struggles, excuse me. And I remember interviewing our former commissioner of education in Kentucky, and I asked him about the divisiveness that he sees in the society and in the country. And he kind of reminded us that, yes, it is very divisive, but is it any more divisive than it was when kids were getting shot and killed at Kent State University? Is it any more divisive when during the civil rights struggles, or when the Vietnam War was going on? So I don't get to say this often, but I'm too young to really remember those, to have lived through those as an adult. And I suspect that, when you look at the broad picture, the big picture, things have always been kind of divisive. But again, that's democracy.
Yes. Well, not wanting to get too far into the politics, but I guess it's democracy in the way our system currently works, isn't it?
Right.
That's a debate I have with friends on a fairly regular basis about whether first past the post versus, proportional representation or alternative, all of that. And what's the best one? I think the only real consensus we ever hit is the current one isn't the best one.
Yeah.
Which, draw your own conclusions from that, I think. But.
Yeah. I think I was just glancing through the headlines today, and I think Nevada had a primary yesterday, I guess. And in their system, Nikki Haley, or Trump, of course, I guess he wasn't on that ballot. There were no delegates awarded, but none of the above outscored Nikki Haley on their ballot. So I guess
that's embarrassing, isn't it?
Satisfaction, yeah.
Well, maybe retirement in someone else's future then as well. But
yes, exactly.
Let's go back a bit then to your career experiences as well. For those of us who don't know, or for who are maybe not from the States, what is a superintendent? Is that an administrative role, or is it still teaching, or is it a bit of both? Yeah,
it's a good question. It's like the CEO of local school districts. So in the United States, we've got school districts that might be the same as a city, as the municipality. I'm trying to think but even in Chicago, which is the third largest school district, that still has a separate board of education. I believe it's appointed by the mayor now, because they've changed models. Someone I forget, but we have there are units of government. Typically independent units of government with taxing authority. They may or may not be contiguous with city lines and boundaries, or even county lines. In Kentucky, most of our school districts are the same as the county, but they're still independent taxing governmental bodies with locally elected boards. We have some independent school districts as well, but they're units of government. elected boards of education to govern, and then they hire the superintendent, who acts as the CEO of the school district.
Okay, fair enough. And is it like a minimum qualification that you have to have some teaching experience before you can do that, or is that just the norm?
Each state can designate the kinds of requirements that they may have. Typically, you have to be state certified as a superintendent. And I think it's fair to say that typically you have to go through a period of teaching and then administrative and then coursework, of course, to qualify for your superintendent certificate. So when I got mine in Illinois, the rule was you had to teach for 2 years minimally. And then with the appropriate coursework, then you could qualify for your administrative certificate, which allowed you to hold any administrative job short of superintendent. And then after you're an administrator for 2 years or more, then you, with the additional coursework, would qualify for a superintendent certificate. And so there was the process that I had to follow. Some places have alternative certifications, especially there was a movement to bring in superintendents, and sometimes I would just call them CEOs. I think Milwaukee is one that comes to mind, where they had a retired military officer as the superintendent because of those alternative certification routes that sometimes some states would do. And I think that's a movement that I may not have been watching as carefully as I used to be, but none are coming to mind. Although I think in Colorado there was, I don't think he is currently, but I believe a former governor was the superintendent. He was either state superintendent or I think maybe Denver superintendent. That's just, I'm not 100% certain of that, but there was that movement, and I'm not seeing that movement anymore. Typically now, superintendents have all come through the ranks of classroom teaching, building level principal, and then up to district office.
Okay, yeah, which makes sense. And I think it does set it apart slightly from CEO in the business world.
And probably every industry would say, we're special, we're unique. You've got to come through the ranks because otherwise you just don't understand us. And to some degree that may be true, but the fact is that within education, within public education in particular, there are a number of idiosyncrasies. There are a number of unique aspects of this. You know, the most obvious is that we don't have a profit measure. Our outcomes are different. We're helping educate generations. We're not trying to have a successful quarterly profit report. And so defining success is a little tougher to do in public education. We look at test scores. That's probably the most easily comparable measure. And the major tests that we offer are the best that we have, but they don't tell the whole story. But the whole story cannot be told in easily measurable outcomes. And so that's frustrating for people that want to be able to look at District A and District B and see which one's better, because it's just not that easy.
Yeah, it's funny you mentioned the testing, and I get that it's one of the only metrics that you can actually measure it by. But at the same time, I was just talking to someone else about this the other day. You get to that point towards the end of your education where all you're really learning is how to pass tests. Mm-hmm. And you're not necessarily learning the practical skills that you need for the workplace or life generally.
Yeah, and the reality is the only thing that those test scores really measure is the wealth of a community. Because if you look at the test scores on state achievement tests and you line those up on a graph, and then you also overlay that with community wealth, generally speaking, the higher the income, the higher the scores. And it's and so low achievement tends to be reflected in lower income communities. And that just speaks to the power of money and the privileges that come with that. And so when you're not worrying about how you're going to put food on the table, then you've got resources to buy books, computers, and take trips and travel and go to the library and have literally, even in the computer age, to still have print in your world, in your home, and books and newspapers and magazines. And while much of that is still online and not as visible, those are still the privileges that are reflected. So when you can see that there is an outlier, a district in a lower income community that's really achieving above the norm in spite of wealth, those are the ones to watch. And likewise, if a school is really underperforming and they're otherwise in one of the wealthier communities, you got to ask what's going on there too.
Yeah, that's interesting. And
we're also seeing post-COVID now increasing numbers of homeschooled students, which is a real interesting phenomenon, because typically, I think it's safe to say that most individuals who choose homeschooling are doing it for religious purposes. That they feel that they want to give their children a religious foundation that is not found, of course, in public schools and should not be found in public schools because of the separation of church and state. That's those numbers are increasing, I think, especially post-COVID, where parents had their kids at home. And it's something that requires such enormous commitment. I could never have done it. I never would have inflicted that kind of harm on my children, not because of the public school, the homeschool model, but because of the kind of teaching that I would have done. There's something about having an arm's length distance from your students and from your teachers, I think. I think when you go to school, there's something, that time away from parents is fine. If it was 24 hours a day of, that was school, that was home, that was dinner time, that was lunch, breakfast, everything, kind of hard on the kids, I think.
Yeah, I think hard on the parent too. I mean, it reminds me of all of the sitcoms over the years where there was a character who was a teacher and they end up teaching their own kid. That's enough for me to know it's a bad idea.
Yeah. I give those parents credit. I really do. I just, I had one of my students at the university who I saw him with a group of friends, and that whole group came from, they were homeschooled, and just the nicest kids who I have just the most respect for. And they're smart, bright kids. And I think their families did it for religious reasons, as I understand. So that's an interesting phenomenon, because there's a growing number of families choosing the homeschooling route. I don't know what that's going to mean for public education down the road, but that seems to be a trend that's increasing here.
Well, so not to stray too far back into the politics of education again, given the period in your life that you were in that career, it's sort of the 80s, early 90s, late 90s, that must have been quite a difficult time to be doing that as a gay man.
No, because I was not out. I didn't come out until 2010. Okay. I had been married 20 years. I was in my last superintendency at that time, and that's one of the interesting things that I'm learning about in my research, because I've got some superintendents who were administrators, or at least they were well into their careers in the 80s during the AIDS epidemic. And one of the people that I interviewed was fired just for being seen in a gay neighborhood. And of course, we've come a long ways from that. And not to get too far off the question, but I do remember my first principalship. I was hired on whatever day of the week it was, and the superintendent said, "Tonight you're going to come to the board meeting." And there were the other principals. We didn't know what we were doing in the closed session, which was private from the public meeting. And this was in 1993. And the superintendent was shared with the board that we had one or more children in the school district with AIDS, not HIV positive, but with full-blown AIDS. And because of the confidentiality, no one could know who they were, which school they were in, which classroom they were in. So you can imagine at that time, again, still early 90s, there's this fear legitimately about AIDS and how it's getting transmitted, and what can we do, and how are we going to catch it, and all that stuff. And you could have been a teacher with one of those children in your class and not know about it. But that was fine, because what we learned was it didn't matter, because you're not going to catch it in a school. We had all the training on universal practices, which was basically, if there's a body fluid, don't touch it. Well, guess what? We never would touch it anyway. I mean, we've been teachers, elementary teachers.
Why would you? Yeah.
with all sorts of body fluids. And the younger the kids are, the more the body fluids there are in a classroom. Yeah, sure, and we didn't need to be told, don't touch it. We weren't touching it anyway. But, over time, we kind of got over that fear. And so there were those superintendents that came up through that period. And then I'm seeing other groups of superintendents who, some will say, I'm a superintendent, period. Who I sleep with, what my personal life is irrelevant to my job. Then there are other superintendents who say, nonsense. I am a gay superintendent and I am an advocate for my LGBTQ students. And that's very much their sexual identity is very much tied to their professional identity as well. So,
which side of that debate would you fall on, do you think, if you were to do it again?
Yeah, good question. I would probably have been the advocate. And when I came out, so I came out in 2010. First, I came out to my family. And then the next question was, do I come out at work too? Because superintendency is a very political position. You start making decisions, and there's always somebody on the short end of the stick. On any decision you make, someone who's disagreeing with it. And so I first came out to my board, and I had a wonderful board president. She was a retired first grade teacher, just a lovely person, very supportive. She understood the role of the Board of Education, which is governance, and it's not running the schools. It's making sure that the schools are well run by the superintendent. But I called her up and I said, Lynn, I've got something to share with you. Do you mind coming in to the office when you've got a minute? So she did. And I told her, I sat her down. I said, Lynn, just want you to know that I'm gay, and I came out to my family just over the holidays. And she said, oh, thank God. I said, well, it's an interesting response. What's that about? She said, I thought you were going to quit. so the gay thing was really nothing. And so that was probably in the winter of 2010. And then I think it was the following summer in August when it was the back to school orientation. Everyone's coming back for the first time. And that's when I shared with all 600 employees my sexual orientation in the context of dealing with change. Because at that time, we were dealing with No Child Left Behind. Teachers were being asked to change their practices. There was all kinds of new assessments, a lot of change in schools. And so I was couching my comments about change and our relationship with change. And I related it to my particular relationship with change and how my family's life had changed so dramatically. I also did that intentionally, not only to be out open, and it was an elementary school district, so there, it might have been different if it was high school students where kids are really starting to come to terms with whatever identity they have. But the elementary school, there's still some of that, but it was more as standing up for my queer employees, the teachers, because I knew there were, of course, with 600 employees, there's some are going to be gay and all along the queer spectrum. So it was perhaps more of a signal to them that they're supported by me. It was also calculated in that the positions are very political positions, superintendent. And if I was with friends in Boys Town in Chicago, and some of my employees were there, or people recognized me and be like, oh, why is Ray at a Boys Town bar and not home with his family. And so from the standpoint of trying to get ahead of that politically, that was part of the calculation. And in fact, there was one time before I had come out to the entire staff, I was at a board meeting where rumors were circulating that I would guess I was 50 years old. I think my board president was probably in her late 60s, maybe early 70s. I'm not sure. But she was retired. And because she was so supportive of the initiatives that I brought to the district, surely we must have been having an affair, because that is the only logical explanation that the board president would be so supportive of some of these initiatives. This is the kind of thinking some people had. And I remember the one board member in closed session saying, well, someone doesn't know something about you that we know. So having come out to the board insulated me from the rumors that the board president and I were having an affair.
Sure. Human nature is a funny thing sometimes, isn't it?
Well, looking back, it's a funny thing to look at the time. It's just like, how stupid are people? Just what are they thinking?
Yeah, I mean, it can be quite insulting, can't it? I don't have to engage with the merit of your argument if I can just accuse you of having an affair with someone. Like,
That's right. Yeah. That's right. Yeah.
Yeah. Interesting. Well, thank you for sharing that story. It is interesting, and it's nice to hear that you had some support as well, not just at home but at work.
Yeah, because as part of that process of deciding to come out at work, I did some research. I talked to a fellow gay superintendent who was out, who later went on to be the president of the National Administrators Group. But his journey was not a pleasant one. He was outed by a parent, so it was not on his terms. I had conversations with our field service director for the Illinois Association of School Boards to get his perspective on how he thinks my board would take it, whether it would be, in terms of how would it impact my career negatively. And my journey through that process probably could not have been better. It was a very smooth, accepting process. And what we're finding now, too, is it's actually an advantage. In some of my research that I'm doing with superintendents, some have found careers in very good school districts exactly because the board, and these typically tend to be upper class, progressive communities, they want a gay superintendent, because if you have a gay superintendent, it shows that they embrace diversity and that they're leaders of the pack. And that's great. So some people have built their career on that. It's paid to be gay in some respects. But I also know other people have had much more of a rougher journey and a very unpleasant one where there have been threats of violence, and real concerns for physical safety, for career advancement. I mean, these are the stories that I've already published a book chapter and another peer-reviewed journal article for. That's what I ended up with so much data, and the stories were so powerful of these individuals. That's why I'm working on the book project now, because I had so much data and the stories from these superintendents, which were really stories of courage and integrity and bravery, and standing up for kids in ways that they've never been asked to before. I didn't want to miss all of those stories because of word limits on book chapters and articles. I had to leave most of the good stuff out. And so that's why now I'm working on the book, to really incorporate all of those stories, and also to expand my base of the ones who I've interviewed too, to get other experiences as well.
And I guess it makes the process of the research easier as well, because when you're interviewing people who've been through it, they know you've been through something similar, and so they're more likely to identify with you and be more open with their stories. Yeah,
there's a real credibility issue there. And it's worked to be a credible researcher. And I've also had the good experience of, while it's a national pool that I drew from, it was kind of a convenient sample in terms of having access to people. It was ones who knew someone, a gay superintendent somewhere, and then kind of word of mouth. And all of those interviews were conducted over Zoom. And since then, I've started to attend some conferences where those interviewees are also involved with. And so I've actually been able to do some follow-up face-to-face interviews. And it's kind of a ongoing research. And it's just been fascinating and a real privilege to get to know some of these people, these real trailblazers.
Yeah, and it sounds like a incredibly rewarding experience as well. So
yeah,
living the dream in retirement. Hey.
Yeah.
Something else I'm going to ask you about, because we've not really mentioned it yet, but you've, at some point in your career, I think relatively recently, but correct me if I'm wrong, you went off and got some training in storytelling and stand-up comedy.
Yeah. I guess it was perhaps partly a midlife crisis or something. It was mid-40. I was mid-40s, I guess. The crisis of the year, I guess. And I was back in Chicago, and I guess two things happened. In my mid to late 40s, which we can come back to the other one. But one thing was I started running marathons. I had never done anything physical. I was never in sports or anything like that. And now that I'm 64, I'll be running 3 marathons this year. I joke that I go to my class reunion and I see people, who are dead or they're limping and having surgeries and talking about the new hip, the new knee, the new whatever that they're getting. And the joke with my doctor and myself is I saved myself for my later years. And there's probably something to that, because so many of my classmates went into the trades and have just abused their bodies physically for decades. And I didn't do that. So that was one thing. But then the other thing that I did was I was being in the Chicago area. I had always known about Chicago's Second City Theater. And so many of American comics, and Canadian ones too, because of the Second City in Toronto, have come through Second City. So many of the big names had a stint there. And so everyone who signs up for the beginning improv program sees themselves as the next Colbert or, Tina Fey or whoever, your comedy idol is, who's gone through Second City. And so I spent the year doing the beginning of improv program. And I had amazing improv teachers, just phenomenal. My first one was Judy Fabjans, who we sadly lost to cancer a few years back. But she changed my life. She opened up doors. And the thing about improv is you got to get out of your skin. You got to get out of your mind, your head, and being worried about, what are people going to think and how silly can I be or whatever. And Judy was just the perfect teacher for that first class to kind of take us by the hands. And because so much of my persona was a professional persona as a school superintendent, as a principal, mostly as a school superintendent. And to kind of break through that was a real gift that Judy gave us all. And she became a friend and her family's friend. But that was just a wonderful experience, except for one thing. I never fully got comfortable with improv because, you go up on stage and within 30 seconds, you've established a relationship with your partner on stage, and you're not coming up with witty jokes, but you're finding the funny within that relationship. I never got comfortable with hoping something witty was going to come out of my mouth just at the spur of the moment, because most of the time something dumb would come out of my mouth at the spur of the moment. But I did it. And the final class project was an improv show on the main stage of Second City. And so it was basically like a glorified talent show from when you were in third grade for family and friends, but you were on the same boards on that stage as so many of the big names that came through. And so even though we were the ones with minimal talent sharing that same stage as the ones who went on for huge careers, That next day at work was like, you can't touch me. You want to criticize me about something? You can't touch me because I just did Second City. I was just on the main stage of Second City the night before. So it was a wonderful experience, but I never got comfortable improvising witty stuff. So the next step was, well, I still like the comedy thing. Let's start doing stand-up. And I think it's an experience that everyone should have. And that's the experience of standing up on stage and telling the world, here's what I think is funny, and not having a single laugh. Complete silence. The first time I did stand-up was in Tampa, Florida, because I didn't know anyone in Tampa, Florida. And so I figured if I'm going to humiliate myself, which I did, no one's going to know about it afterwards. So I did it there. And again, it was just awful. But it was the perfect place to bomb, because the club manager pulled me back afterwards and he said, would you like some feedback? And I said, sure, absolutely. And he showed me his process for writing jokes. And he showed me on his computer, he had all the jokes that he had written out. And then he highlighted the premise and the punchline. He said everything else that's not highlighted is just filler. It's just blah, blah, blah. And you want to cut it out. And that's how you write in a highly shortened version, but that's how you write a tight joke. And so it was great feedback. And I mean, what people don't really realize, I think, about stand-up is that it's not the act of getting up and telling the world what you think is funny. The hard part is just writing and rewriting and rewriting and rewriting and reworking a joke. That's what the process is. Most of the time when you're doing stand-up, you're in a bar with a dozen drunk stand-up comics. Maybe you've got one legitimate audience member, but everyone's just there to get their time on stage. And then they're off to the next bar that's got a stand-up night, an open mic night, that they can go get more experience. So it's a humbling experience. And I did some stand-up also because I speak Portuguese. I speak bad Portuguese. I was going off back to Rio de Janeiro, and where my wife's family is from, and where we've lived a couple times. And so I found a group, a stand-up comedy group called Comédia em Pé. And I emailed them and I said, hey, I just stand up here in Chicago. I'm going to be in Rio. Can I join you? And so they gave me 5 minutes. I was their international comic, period, their guest, whatever, on the show. And it was like, I got more laughs than ever before. And the other thing was, it wasn't like what I was used to in terms of the audience of, a dozen other fellow comics drinking beer, waiting to get up and then get out. This was an auditorium of like 200 or 300 people. And they weren't comics and they weren't drunk. Well, I don't know if they were drunk or not, but there was like 300 people. And so I get up there and I got more laughs than I ever did anywhere in the United States. And I went up to one of the comics from the group afterwards. And I said, they really like the jokes, huh? He said, well, they thought your Portuguese was part of the act. I said, no, that was just my best language skills that I put out there. That wasn't part of the act. That was not intentional, but hey, if it gets a laugh, it gets a laugh, So I did the stand-up for a while. And then, but again, that's work. And after a few years, I lost the commitment to spending that much time doing that. And that's when I moved over to storytelling. And I think the reason I started to do that was at Second City Theater, it's gone corporate now, but pre-COVID, they would have Sunday mornings when they didn't normally have shows going on. They gave us one of the sides studio black box theaters, down in Skybox Theater, and they offered it for us in I think it was maybe, I forget now if it was like 10 o'clock was stand up, and then 11 o'clock was storytelling, and then they would start their matinee shows later in the afternoon on a Sunday. But otherwise, Sunday mornings, it was dark. And so they gave us the theater, and that's how we would get experience doing both stand-up and storytelling. And I just started to evolve more towards the storytelling. And I found it so much easier and more fun because everyone has a story. You can't get it wrong. With stand-up, you can get it wrong. You can just have a punchline that's not funny. You can get it wrong. But in storytelling, you cannot get it wrong because it's your story and yours alone. There are better and worse ways to craft a story, to build a story around an event, to build up the tension, to load it with vivid details that paint a picture in the listener's mind. But fundamentally at the core, it's your story and you can't get it wrong. So I evolved towards that, but I am so grateful that I did the improv and the stand-up because I found that it makes my storytelling much more engaging, more humorous. They aren't all funny stories, and they certainly don't have to be. But I found that it really contributed to my evolution as a storyteller. And so I've been doing storytelling now for years. It's hard to say how many years. And I do a lot of training for storytelling. I've done that with a number of groups, professional associations. The one that I've been most consistent with is this coming April will be the third consecutive year that I've done a pre-conference workshop for school board members who attend the National School Boards Association to learn how to tell the stories of the successes of their school districts. Because with storytelling, we can either tell our own personal stories or the stories of the organization that we represent. And so it's a powerful tool. It's important for speakers. It's important for leaders because it's how we become memorable. When we shut our mouths and sit down and leave, are people going to remember us? Well, they're going to remember our stories and the lessons that we've learned or the points that we want to make. Because if we just kind of say what's important to us, if we can say what our values are in kind of bullet point fashion on a PowerPoint slide, if they've even heard it the first time, most likely they will not remember it 5 minutes later. But if you tell a well-crafted story, they will remember you, they will remember the lesson, they'll remember the learning that you experienced. And so it's a real powerful technique for leaders and of organizations. It's an important technique for anyone. I tell people if you're in a job interview and anytime you're asked one of the common questions of tell us a time when or give us an example of, the interviewer is asking for a story. And if you can tell a story that creates a vivid picture in their mind, they will remember you. They will remember what you learned, what's important to you, what your values are. So it's been it started as a performance art, but it's really evolved into a professional skill. And it's a professional skill that every leader has to have.
Yeah, I agree, especially when it's things like the corporate values statement, like they just disappear, don't they? They usually change so often anyway that nobody remembers it at the best of times. But I think that's such an important aspect of leadership. Yeah, generally is the communication, isn't it? And that's what you're talking about.
I remember when I was at GE, again, I was there just for 3 short years, my only experience in corporate America. But the thing that I remember, and I've been gone from there since 2009, because after 9/11, everyone was jumping into the security business and there were too many people in the market, too many players. And so GE chopped up the company and sold it off. But when we would meet, the CEO of the business always reminded us, even though at the end of the day, we were judged on how much stuff we sold out of trunks and out of boxes, essentially, because it was GE security or it was technology we were selling. But at the end of the day, he reminded us of why we did what we did. why we got out of bed, and that was to help keep the world safe. And that's a whole lot more motivating than waking up in the morning and saying, I got to sell some cameras today, some video cameras or some access control. No, that's not a reason to get out of bed. But playing a little part in keeping the world safe in a post 9/11 environment, that was powerful. That was powerful. And that was kind of like, he didn't necessarily get into a story about that, but there was that message, that motivating message that reminded us of why it is what we did.
Yeah, and it's perhaps a rare example of where the story is so heavily implied that you fill it in on your own anyway.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
I can't really think of another one right now, but I'm sure there must be a couple of other examples of that.
Well, I had two examples that I always share from the school board's training. And I do it with some caution because they're fairly dramatic. And the key is, we don't all have those stories of the time we lifted a car off the child and saved the child's life. We don't usually have those kinds of huge celebrity kind of status events. The best stories can be just normal, routine, everyday things about how you stubbed your toe getting out of bed and what you learned from it. I mean, that's just a kind of a real base kind of example. But the point is, it's something that the stories that we hear should be something that we can also relate to. But the two powerful stories that I remember, and I'm not revealing any confidences because they both shared these in a public setting, but one was a school board member from a Western state who was 26 years old. He was the vice president. It was it's one of the largest school districts in the United States. And he told the story about, in high school, breaking into school buses in the bus yard. And you want to guess why he was breaking into buses? To sleep.
Sleep.
Wow, okay. He had been kicked out of his house, or family issues. He was unhoused, and that's where he would sleep when he was 16. So 10 years later, he's now turned things around. And you talk about a story, a powerful story about now he is an elected school board member of one of the largest school districts in the country and vice president of the board. There's another story of a school board member from the Midwest who was campaigning for school board in his community. It's a fairly large community with some challenges, and he got shot while campaigning. You talk about commitment and why people run for school boards, because those are generally unpaid positions where you just get a lot of abuse, because everything you do, there's always somebody who's mad at you. And he felt it was still worth it. It didn't stop him. Getting shot while he was campaigning did not stop him. It kind of re-motivated him, or added to his motivation. And it was more incentivized to make a difference in that community and to change that around. Again, the good news is you don't have to sleep in a bus. You don't have to get shot to have a great story. Great stories can be things that just happen to you in your normal, daily, routine, boring life, but something that you've learned from. And that's something that we can all relate to then. Because when we relate, it's also something, it's not only that you as a speaker are memorable, but you're relatable and you've got credibility because, yeah, I've had that same experience. I know what you're talking about. I may have handled it differently than you have, and I get to learn how you handled it. So stories are power. They're powerful.
Absolutely. Yeah. Conscious of time. So I'll move on in a minute, but first, one quick question, because now that I know that you spend time doing stand-up comedy, it feels like it would be rude if I didn't ask you to tell us a joke.
Sure, my signature joke, and I'm not guaranteeing that it's the best. Maybe if I tell it important, you'll laugh. You'll at least laugh at me. No, I was on a flight coming back from Los Angeles a couple of weeks ago, and there were, I always try to get on first on the plane. So I'm sitting in my seat and I see this young couple get on the plane. They take their seats and it's clear that they're madly, madly in love. They each have one of the ear pods. They're listening to their music, same music. They've got the can of Coke that they brought on, 2 straws. It was like they were on a date. They were just so madly low. And then we took off, and there was, how the plane kind of rumbles down, and then you get off and it starts to level off, but there was some turbulence, and now it was a fairly rough turbulence. So now they're embracing each other, and, like it's going to be the end of the world right there. It was going to be their last moment together. And I tried not to be the creepy old guy and stare at this spectacle, but it was just awkward sitting in the middle seat between them. The visuals joke.
Nice. Yeah, I like it. And anyone who spent time on a plane even briefly understands the personal space part of that as well.
Yeah. It's a joke that works a little better when, like, you've got the headphones with the wires. It's a little better, but so I've had to update it as technology has.
Yeah, fair enough. Yeah. Yeah, I can imagine the wire might have got a bit
exactly. That is exactly. The joke gets better.
Yeah, indeed. Awesome. Couple of quick questions for you about leadership then. From your whole career so far, I did say so far because you've only technically retired.
Right.
What's the biggest leadership lesson that you've learned in all that time?
Leaders have to be collaborative. There's just isn't much place in the world for leaders who just order and dictate people around. That's especially important in public education because we typically don't have the ability that if you've got a team member who's just not fully there, who's just not contributing, they may be tenured. And so they may have virtually lifetime employment unless they've committed some egregious act, pretty much their years for life, because of the whole academic freedom issues and all that stuff, and just the muscle that they've been able to exert politically. And that's fine. It's just the world in which we live. But it requires that leaders make sure that people are engaged. They feel like they're contributing. They're looking forward to coming to work. They still remember why they're coming to work, why they're getting out of bed, because you don't, in business where you can just say, you're just not fitting in and we're going to set you loose. That typically is not at the disposal of school leaders. And so there are the positive and the negative reasons. The positive reasons are that we want people to contribute. We want people to feel like they're productive, like they're committed, engaged employees. Don't even worry about the negative part that they're going to get fired because take that away. It's just not in the picture for the most part. But so that's really important in terms of understanding how we need to be a leader. The thing that I would have done differently is oftentimes as a superintendent, I would bump heads with my boards of education. And because I would come into my district and make certain observations, I'd make certain recommendations to my board, particularly in terms of people, because the middle management leadership, the principals, was something that I did have control over. And there were two principals in the course of my career that we had to part ways because it wasn't good for kids. Unfortunately, because the superintendency is very political, those individuals had friends on the board and they were drinking buddies. And I still made those recommendations and forced the issue without the full support of my board. I had a majority of the board in one case because of some foolishness and unethical behaviors. The second one, I think I was not successful. And I think he's still working there in that district. But the lesson I learned was I really should have avoided those head bumping experiences until I had the full support of the board, rather than just bring issues to them and then hope that I had the support and let them vote. And however they voted, they voted. I should have worked more closely with them and probably just learned to bite my tongue on some issues that were not popular, would not have been done the way I would have done them. But my long-term tenure at those places would have been increased. The last letter of resignation I wrote was during the Clinton administration, which was a long time ago. And I've had a number of jobs. I've had a bunch of jobs. And so they always took care of it for me by saying, Ray, it's time that we part ways. And so I think the real key takeaway from those experiences would be that as a superintendent, I needed to work more closely. I needed to work intimately with my boards. Because then they were also, I didn't mean for this to happen, but it happened. They were put in a position where they had to make some unpopular decisions, and they didn't like that. And so that's what I would, if I were to do one thing over again, it would be to make sure that I work hand in glove with my board. And if it got to be an intolerable situation, I always had the option to leave, or to get a different job. But it was a kind of a rough, brutal, bumpy career based on that. I've had some wonderful, wonderful, amazing board members, but it doesn't take many to really bring a lot of drama and chaos into a relationship. So that's what I would have done differently if I were to do it over again.
I think there's a good lesson in there actually about being able to collaborate with your stakeholders in any leadership position, including the people you're leading in a lot of cases. Yeah. And who among us can honestly say that their words have never got them in trouble?
Yeah. and keep in mind that there were the boards were not my stakeholders. They were not my community. They were my boss.
That is a kind of stakeholder, isn't it? But yeah.
I like to say, watching your words. When my career at the American School of Brasilia ended, I was sitting in the ambassador's office, and I had vented in some emails to my board president, who was a diplomat at the embassy. And I'm sitting there and I got called over to the ambassador's office. I'm sitting there in his office, and he was a Clinton appointee, in fact. And he was from one of the, I think, North Carolina, and with a Southern accent, he'd ask me, Ray, did you really write? And then he would read the email that I had sent to my board president. I was like, well, those do sound vaguely like my words. And then he'd go on to the next one. Did you really say? And you read that and I go, well, it does seem vaguely familiar. I guess that probably were my words. Then you go on to the next email and finally say, if you think there's going to be Ray Lauk with you sitting in a wheelchair behind that desk when you're 90 years old, you're wrong. So that's how I was fired by a U.S. ambassador once.
That's ouch.
But it gives me a fun story to share today.
Yeah, fair enough. That's always the danger of venting in an email, isn't it? But you've always got the defense of, well, an email's so difficult to interpret. It really wasn't what I meant by that. And
I did have one, a different district, a school district in Illinois, where a board member, to this day, I remember this, and it was like, this was probably like, I don't know, 2012 or something. And the board members, they had an email that I had written to an employee, and she said, it's so negative. It was a disciplinary email. I was scolding him. He was being a bad boy, and I was scolding him. And I mean, I don't know a positive way to discipline. So there had to be some negative words in there.
Yes. Yeah, that old chestnut. Don't be so negative, David. Yeah, the number of times I heard that. And it's like, well, I mean, I don't know how else to talk about it. We've missed the deadline. We've failed to give a deliverable. We've missed a budget. I mean, how else do you phrase these things? Please tell me.
Whatever.
Anyway, well, it's all good life experience, isn't it?
Yes. Yeah.
Leadership Heroes.
Okay, last question, and this is my favourite question most of the time. It's called Leadership Heroes. So the question is, if you had to pick one person, and they could be alive or dead, past or present, real or fictional, who in your opinion would perfectly embody leadership who would that person be and why?
Sure. I had a number of great, excellent mentors. When I was a school board member, the superintendent was G. Allen Gogo, and he was my model of what it meant to be a leader. And he had influenced me greatly in terms of my early career. So I'm going to answer this in two ways. One was Al Gogo, who was just a phenomenal leader. And as a leader, not everyone appreciated the decisions he made, but I loved his intellect, his ability to analyze situations, to put kids first. And he was also a great speaker too, when he was making presentations. So he was one of the people who was really formative, one of the leaders who was formative in my career and in my life. And he was a friend until he passed away a few years ago. I believe he was well into his 90s. So he was one of them. I've had so many mentors. If you look just in terms of the public, who some of the great leaders are that I look up to, Jimmy Carter, our former president, who's in hospice right now. But he was the first president that I voted for. And I had been giving a speech in Atlanta, Georgia in 2019. And so I thought, there was a Saturday and it was like Sunday, I'm free. So I went online and Jimmy Carter was still doing his Sunday school lessons at his Maranatha church in Plains, Georgia. And he was scheduled to be doing the Sunday school that next morning. So I got a hotel in Americus, Georgia, which is right outside of Plains, drove down there, showed up at the church at 3 a.m, because it was first come, first serve. And at 3 a.m, I was already like 33rd in line. There were people who'd been there all night. I get into the church and there he is. I made it because of the time that I got there. I was in the main sanctuary area. And so I got to hear Jimmy Carter speak and share his lessons. And it was just amazing. And then afterwards, he and Mrs. Carter stayed until the last visitor got their picture taken with them. And so I've got my picture with the Carters, and it's a special moment. But there's a person who, even though his presidency was rough, and by many accounts, not that successful, but what he did after leaving office, his post-retirement career was amazing in terms of the work that he has done for Habitat for Humanity and for peace throughout the world. A great leader, and he's one that I admire, and I am proud of the picture that I have in my office with the Carters. Two
amazing examples. Jimmy Carter, firstly, is quite an overlooked president. I don't think anyone's chosen him before, so that's always a good pick. Yeah. And then the first choice as well, it's very rare that I get an answer to this question where it's someone that the guest has actually worked with, met, knows, and has experienced their leadership firsthand. So that is a really powerful example as well.
And I've had so many mentors. So really narrowing it down to one or two is tough. Throughout my dissertation, I had amazing professors who were on my committee who supported me. Just so many people. I guess when you're in your 60s, you get to look back and you've met a lot of people and worked with a lot of people and been influenced by a lot of people.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, Ray, it's been wonderful meeting you. I've really enjoyed this conversation. I think the only thing left for me to ask you is if any of the listeners would like to learn more about you, about what you do, perhaps get a copy of one of those book chapters or a whole book even, I don't know. Would you like to point them towards your website or similar?
Certainly. So my website is rlauk.com, my first initial and last name. So it's rlauk.com. Email is rlauk@rlauk.com. And on Amazon, my book, Fuel for Learning, is available, which I think I mentioned when I worked at GE. I learned a lot of things I still speak on, and that's the topic that I learned about how to accomplish your goals and get results. And FUEL stands for Focus, Urgency, Energy, and Learning from What Works. So it's Fuel for Learning on Amazon.
Lovely, and easy to remember as well. But I will put all of that in the episode description so people can find the links and just click a button. So that's always easier.
Yeah.
Well, as I say, it's been great talking to you today, Ray. Thank you so much, and have a great rest of your day.
Thank you, David. I enjoyed it. Thanks for the thoughtful questions. Appreciate it.
So many great stories there. A pretty good joke as well in the middle there, which I hope you laughed at. I certainly did. And what great, meaningful lessons there about leadership and life. Ray, thank you again so much for being so generous with your time and sharing your experiences. It's very much appreciated. Listener, if you would like to learn more about Ray and what he does, I've popped those links in the episode description, the show notes. So please do click on those, give it a read, reach out to him. I'm sure he'd love to hear from you. Thank you so much for being with us today. I hope you'll be back tomorrow. I will be chatting with retired US Navy Master Chief Raymond Kemp about his experiences and lessons in leadership and teamwork. And that's all I've got time for today. Until next time, be a leader, not a boss.